My husband's unthinkable actions during childbirth shattered our marriage. Can I forgive him? Or is our family already broken beyond repair? 29F, and my husband Jake, 32M, have been together for 6 years, married for 3. We were both ecstatic when we found out we were expecting our first child. The day we saw those 2 pink lines on the pregnancy test, Jake swept me off my feet and spun me around our tiny apartment kitchen. We laughed, we cried, and we started dreaming about our future as parents. The first few months were a whirlwind of excitement. We spent weekends browsing baby stores, debating names, and transforming our spare room into a nursery. Jake would come home from work with little gifts, a tiny pair of sneakers, a stuffed animal, or a book of baby names. Every night, he'd talk to my belly, telling our unborn child about his day and how much we already loved them. But as my pregnancy progressed, things got tough. The morning sickness hit me like a truck, and it wasn't just in the mornings. I was nauseated all day, every day. I couldn't keep anything down, not even water some days. Jake would hold my hair back as I retched into the toilet, rubbing soothing circles on my back and whispering words of encouragement. Then came the diagnosis of gestational diabetes. Suddenly, our carefree approach to pregnancy was replaced with strict meal plans, constant blood sugar monitoring, and frequent doctor's appointments. I felt like my body was betraying me, like I was failing at the one thing I was supposed to be good at, growing our baby. But through it all, Jake was my rock. He learned everything he could about gestational diabetes, prepared meals that fit my new dietary restrictions, and even pricked his own finger to show me that the blood sugar tests weren't so bad. He'd massage my swollen feet at night and listen patiently as I vented my frustrations about the pregnancy. As we got closer to my due date, we started discussing birth plans. I was nervous about the delivery, but having Jake by my side made me feel stronger. We toured the hospital, attended birthing classes together, and practiced breathing exercises in our living room. Jake would hold my hand and tell me, "We've got this, babe. You're the strongest person I know." I was adamant that I wanted Jake in the delivery room. The thought of going through labor without him terrified me. He'd always agreed, saying he wouldn't miss it for the world. We even joked about him fainting at the sight of blood, but he assured me he'd stay conscious no matter what. However, a few weeks before my due date, Jake started acting strange. It was subtle at first. He'd zone out during conversations about the baby, or change the subject when I brought up the impending birth. I chalked it up to nerves. After all, becoming a parent is a big deal, and I figured he was just processing it in his own way. But as the days went by, his behavior became more pronounced. He was distant, distracted, and wouldn't engage in any baby-related discussions. One night, I found him sitting in the dark nursery, staring at the crib, with a look of sheer panic on his face. "Jake?" I said softly, waddling into the room. "What's wrong?" He jumped, startled by my presence. "Nothing," he mumbled, avoiding my gaze. "Just thinking." I lowered myself into the rocking chair, my hand resting on my swollen belly. "Talk to me, babe. What's going on in that head of yours?" Jake ran his hands through his hair, a nervous habit I'd come to recognize over the years. I don't know if I'm ready for this, Sarah. What if I'm a terrible father? What if I mess up our kid?" I reached out and took his hand, giving it a reassuring squeeze. "Hey, we're in this together, remember? We'll figure it out as we go. No one's born knowing how to be a perfect parent." He nodded, but I could see the doubt lingering in his eyes. We sat in silence for a while, the moonlight casting long shadows across the nursery floor. I thought we'd had a breakthrough, that Jake had opened up about his fears, and we could work through them together. Looking back, I wish I'd pushed harder, asked more questions. Maybe then, what happened next wouldn't have blindsided me so completely. The day I went into labor started like any other. I woke up to a dull ache in my lower back, but I'd been having Braxton Hicks contractions for weeks, so I didn't think much of it. Jake and I had breakfast together, and he headed off to work with a kiss and a promise to keep his phone close. It wasn't until mid-afternoon that I realized this was the real deal. The contractions were getting stronger and more regular. I called Jake, my heart racing with a mix of excitement and fear. "Jake, it's time," I said when he answered. "Can you come home?" There was a pause on the other end of the line, longer than I expected. "Yeah, of course. he finally said, his voice sounding strained. "I'll be right there." When Jake got home, he seemed off. He was quiet and kept checking his phone as he helped me to the car. I tried to engage him in conversation, to share my excitement and nervousness, but he only responded with short, distracted answers. The drive to the hospital was tense. Jake's knuckles were white on the steering wheel, and he barely said a word. I was too focused on my contractions to really process his behavior, but a nagging feeling of unease settled in my stomach. When we arrived at the hospital, Jake helped me out of the car and into a wheelchair. As a nurse wheeled me towards the maternity ward, I noticed Jake pull another nurse aside. They spoke in hushed tones, Jake's face pale and drawn. I strained to hear what they were saying, but another contraction hit, and I lost focus. The next thing I knew, the nurse was pushing me into a delivery room, and Jake was nowhere to be seen. I looked around, confused, and suddenly scared. "Where's my husband?" I asked the nurse, my voice trembling. She gave me a sympathetic look that made my heart sink. "I'm sorry, dear. Your husband won't be joining you in the delivery room. He says he's uncomfortable with blood and medical procedures." I was stunned. Jake had never mentioned anything like this before. We'd talked about the birth so many times, watched videos together, even practiced in our living room. How could he do this now? "There must be some mistake," I said, my voice rising with panic. "Can you please get him? I need him here." The nurse nodded and left the room. A few minutes later, Jake appeared in the doorway. He looked awful, pale, sweating, his eyes darting around the room as if looking for an escape route. "Jake," I said, reaching out for him, "what's going on? We talked about this. You said you'd be here with me." He took a step back, avoiding my outstretched hand. "I'm sorry, Sarah. I can't do this. I thought I could, but I can't." Tears welled up in my eyes, a mix of pain from the contractions and the sting of betrayal. "Please, Jake. I need you. We're supposed to do this together." For a moment, I thought I saw a flicker of resolve in his eyes, but then another contraction hit, and I cried out in pain. Jake's face went even paler, and he stumbled back towards the door. "I'm sorry," he repeated. "I'll be in the waiting room. You can do this, Sarah. You're strong." And with that, he was gone. I was left alone, crying and feeling utterly abandoned, as another contraction ripped through me. The next few hours were a blur of pain, fear, and loneliness. The medical staff was kind and supportive, but they couldn't fill the void left by Jake's absence. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw his face as he walked out that door, leaving me when I needed him most. As the labor progressed and the pain intensified, I found myself calling out for Jake. The nurse held my hand, wiped my brow, and murmured words of encouragement, but it wasn't the same. I wanted my husband, the man who had promised to stand by me through thick and thin. In between contractions, I asked the nurse to check on Jake. Each time, she'd return with the same message: "He's still in the waiting room." I pictured him pacing back and forth, wringing his hands, maybe even considering coming back to me. But he never did. The hours dragged on, and the pain became almost unbearable. I was exhausted, both physically and emotionally. The doctor suggested an epidural, and I agreed, desperate for some relief. As the anesthesiologist prepared the injection, I couldn't help but think that this was something Jake and I should have discussed together. We should have made this decision as a team. After the epidural, the pain subsided, but the emotional turmoil remained. I dozed fitfully between contractions, my dreams filled with images of Jake walking away from me over and over again. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, it was time to push. The delivery room buzzed with activity as nurses and doctors prepared for the final stage of labor. I gripped the sides of the bed, mustering all my strength for what was to come. "Okay, Sarah," the doctor said, positioned at the foot of the bed. "On the next contraction, I want you to push as hard as you can." I nodded, tears streaming down my face. This was it, the moment we'd been waiting for, the moment that should have been a joyous culmination of our journey together. But Jake wasn't here to share it with me. As I pushed, I screamed out in pain and frustration. "Jake!" I cried, even though I knew he couldn't hear me. "Jake, why aren't you here?" The nurses exchanged sympathetic glances, but said nothing, focusing instead on encouraging me to keep pushing. Time seemed to stand still as I strained and pushed, feeling like my body was being torn apart. And then, suddenly, it was over. A tiny cry filled the room, and the doctor held up a squirming, wet bundle. "It's a boy," she announced. Through my exhaustion and tears, I smiled. "My son. Our son." The nurse placed him on my chest, and I looked down at his scrunched-up face in awe. He was perfect. 10 tiny fingers, 10 tiny toes, a tuft of dark hair like Jake's. Jake. The joy of meeting my son was immediately tempered by a wave of sadness and anger. This moment, this miraculous, life-changing moment, was one we were supposed to share. I looked towards the door, half expecting Jake to burst in, full of apologies and eager to meet his son. But the door remained closed. As the nurses cleaned me up and tended to the baby, I asked them to get Jake from the waiting room. I was angry, yes, but I also couldn't imagine denying him this moment with his child. Besides, a small part of me still hoped there was a good explanation for his behavior. The nurse returned a few minutes later with news that made my heart sink even further. "I'm sorry," she said gently. "Your husband left the hospital a few hours ago." I couldn't believe it. Not only had Jake abandoned me during labor, but he'd actually left the hospital entirely, without even waiting to see if his child and I were okay. The hurt and betrayal I felt earlier paled in comparison to this new revelation. Numbly, I reached for my phone on the bedside table. There were no missed calls, no texts from Jake asking about the baby, or apologizing for his absence. With shaking hands, I typed out a message: "I'm done. Find your own way home." The next few hours passed in a haze. I was moved to a recovery room, where nurses came and went, checking on me and the baby. They showed me how to breastfeed, how to change a diaper, how to swaddle, all things Jake and I were supposed to learn together. I kept expecting Jake to show up, to burst through the door with flowers and apologies. But, as the hours ticked by and night fell, I realized he wasn't coming. I spent that first night alone with our son, alternating between marveling at his tiny features and crying silently so as not to wake him. It wasn't until the next afternoon that Jake finally appeared. He walked into my hospital room looking disheveled and ashamed, a bouquet of flowers clutched in his hand like a shield. "Sarah," he said softly, his voice hoarse, "I'm so sorry. I don't know what came over me. I panicked, and I needed some air. And then I went home to shower and change, and I fell asleep. I feel terrible. Can I see the baby?" I looked at him, really looked at him, and all I felt was a deep, aching disappointment. "You fell asleep?" I repeated incredulously. "While I was in labor with your child, you went home and took a nap?" Jake flinched at my tone. "I know it sounds bad. I messed up, Sarah. I messed up so badly. But I'm here now, and I want to make it right. Please, let me see our baby." I glanced over at the bassinet where our son was sleeping peacefully. Part of me wanted to scoop him up and hide him away from Jake, to protect him from the man who had already let him down so profoundly. But another part of me knew that wasn't fair, to Jake or to our son. "His name is Ethan," I said quietly. "Ethan James. The name we picked together, remember?" Jake's eyes filled with tears as he approached the bassinet. He reached out a tentative hand, gently stroking Ethan's cheek with one finger. "He's beautiful," he whispered. "Sarah, I'm so sorry. I know I let you down. I let both of you down. But I swear, I'll do anything to make it right." As I watched Jake with our son, I felt a confusing mix of emotions. There was still anger and hurt, yes, but also a flicker of the love I'd always felt for him. But that love now felt tainted, overshadowed by the memory of being alone when I needed him most. "I think you should go," I said finally, my voice trembling slightly. "I need time to process all of this. I can't even look at you right now without remembering how it felt to be abandoned in that delivery room." Jake looked up from Ethan, his face crumpling. "Sarah, please. I know I messed up, but don't shut me out. We're a family now." "A family?" I repeated, my voice rising. "Families stick together, Jake. Families support each other. What you did, I don't know if I can get past it." "I'll do anything," Jake pleaded. "Therapy, parenting classes, whatever it takes. Please, just give me a chance to make this right." I closed my eyes, suddenly exhausted. "I can't have this conversation right now. Please, just go. I'll call you when I'm ready to talk. Jake hesitated, looking between me and Ethan. Finally, he nodded, placing the flowers on a nearby table. Okay, I understand. But I'm not giving up on us, Sarah. I love you, and I love our son. I'll do whatever it takes to earn your trust back. As Jake left the room, I broke down in tears. I cried for the beautiful moment of Ethan's birth that had been tainted, for the trust that had been shattered, and for the uncertain future that lay ahead. The next few days in the hospital were a blur of diaper changes, feeding attempts, and visits from well-meaning nurses and doctors. My parents came to meet their grandson, their joy tempered by concern for me. I hadn't told them the full story yet, just that Jake and I were having some issues. "Sweetheart," my mom said gently, as she cradled Ethan, "where's Jake? Is everything okay?" I burst into tears then, the whole story spilling out between sobs. My parents listened in shocked silence, exchanging worried glances over my head. "Oh, honey," my mom said when I'd finished, pulling me into a hug. "I'm so sorry you had to go through that alone. What can we do?" My dad, always the more hot-headed of the two, was pacing the small hospital room. "I'll tell you what we can do," he growled. "We can go find that coward and teach him a lesson about responsibility." "Dad, no," I said wearily. "That won't solve anything. I need time to figure out what I want to do." My parents stayed with me until I was discharged, helping me navigate those first few days of motherhood. They didn't push me to make any decisions about Jake, but I could see the concern in their eyes every time they looked at me. Coming home was both a relief and a new kind of challenge. The apartment Jake and I had lovingly prepared for our baby now felt like a minefield of memories and broken promises. Every corner held a reminder of the life we had planned together, the family we were supposed to be. Jake had been texting me daily, asking how Ethan and I were doing, begging for a chance to talk. After a week at home, I finally agreed to meet with him. My mom offered to watch Ethan while Jake and I talked at a nearby coffee shop. When I saw Jake, I was struck by how haggard he looked. Dark circles under his eyes, clothes rumpled, as if he'd slept in them. He jumped up as soon as he saw me, nearly knocking over his chair in his haste. "Sarah," he said, his voice cracking, "thank you for meeting me. How's Ethan? How are you?" I sat down, suddenly feeling the weight of the past weeks crashing down on me. "Ethan's fine. I'm managing." Jake nodded, his eyes never leaving my face. "Sarah, I know I messed up. What I did was unforgivable. But I'm doing everything I can to be better. I've started therapy. I've been going to parenting classes. I even joined a support group for new fathers. I want to be the husband and father you both deserve." I listened to Jake's words, searching his face for any sign of the man who had abandoned me in the delivery room. But all I saw was remorse, determination, and love. "Jake," I said slowly, "I appreciate that you're trying, but I don't know if it's enough. You left me when I needed you most. How can I ever trust you won't do that again?" Jake reached across the table, his hand stopping just short of mine. "I know I broke your trust, and I know it will take time to rebuild it. But Sarah, I love you and Ethan more than anything in this world. I had a moment of weakness, of panic, and I will regret it for the rest of my life. But I'm asking you, begging you, for a chance to make it right." I looked at Jake, really looked at him. I saw the man I fell in love with, the man who had been by my side through so much. But I also saw the man who had let me down in the worst possible way. "I can't give you an answer right now," I said finally. "I need more time." Jake nodded, disappointment and hope warring on his face. "I understand. I'll wait as long as it takes." Over the next few months, Jake proved true to his word. He was there for every pediatrician appointment, every late-night feeding, every milestone. He continued his therapy and parenting classes, and slowly, I began to see real change in him. It wasn't easy. There were times when the anger and hurt would resurface, times when I wasn't sure if we could make it work. But there were also moments of joy, of watching Jake bond with Ethan, of remembering why we had fallen in love in the first place. 6 months after Ethan's birth, Jake and I sat down for another serious talk. This time, it was in our living room, with Ethan sleeping peacefully in his crib nearby. "Jake," I said, taking a deep breath, "I've been doing a lot of thinking. What you did. It hurt me deeply. It broke my trust in a way I never thought possible. But these past months, I've seen how hard you've worked to change, to be there for us. Jake listened intently, hope shining in his eyes. I can't promise that things will ever be exactly the same, I continued, but I'm willing to try. For us, for Ethan, for the family we dreamed of having. It won't be easy, and we still have a lot of work to do, but I'm willing to give us another chance. The relief and joy on Jake's face was palpable. He pulled me into a tight embrace, tears streaming down his face. "Thank you, Sarah," he whispered. "I promise I won't let you down again." As we held each other, Ethan's soft coos came through the baby monitor. We broke apart, sharing a small smile before going to check on our son together. It was a small step, but it was a step forward, as a family. The road ahead wouldn't be easy. Trust, once broken, takes time to rebuild. But as I watched Jake gently lift Ethan from his crib, cooing softly to him, I felt a flicker of hope. We had weathered a storm that could have torn us apart, but here we were, still standing. And maybe, just maybe, we would come out stronger on the other side.